Hello everyone, it's Rob B here with Rob D, and thank you for joining us on the Property Podcast. Now, predicting the future is something that Rob and I have been brave enough to do before, or stupid, depending on your point of view. But this week, we're feeling a little bit more confident than usual because we've got property legend Tom Bloxham helping us out.
Yes, thank you for joining us once again for the Property Podcast, where every Thursday morning, property investors come together to be informed and inspired. We're so lucky to be joined again by Tom Bloxham this week. If anyone is going to have insights into what the future is going to look like, it's going to be him. So it's going to be a great episode coming up. And as if that weren't enough, stick around to the end for Hub Extra, where we've got a cracking video for you, which is going to give you even more value.
So, news story of the week time. And this week's news story comes from Generation Rent. Now, Generation Rent are a non-profit organisation who campaign for private renters. So certainly not known for campaigning for landlords. So Rob, what have you got to say?
Yeah, so normally if you've got a news story from Generation Rent, you'd expect that they'd be saying something silly, attacking landlords, and we'd have to attack them back, and on it would go. But actually they've come up with something quite sensible recently. Some pretty decent economic analysis talking about what happens to rents if landlords exit the market. And the answer is not a lot. Now we'll link to the article so you can go and see the argument for the whole thing. But the point is that for the last couple of years, ever since the tax changes were announced, landlord groups have been going on non-stop about how rents are going to go up as landlords leave the sector, which means that tenants are going to be the ones who are punished by this whole thing. And the evidence has abundantly proved that not to be the case. Rents haven't gone up. If anything, in real terms, they've gone down a bit. And the reason to highlight this is that I think it's really unhelpful when people separate out into different camps, and you've got the people campaigning for tenants and the people campaigning for landlords, and they're both forming their arguments and cherry picking their data to have a pop at the other lot. It's just not helpful. So I think it's important to acknowledge when people have said something sensible, whichever side of the debate that they're on, and also important not to make dishonest claims or unrealistic claims just to support your own argument, because ultimately this isn't a playground fight. Property investment has an effect on where people live, which is one of the most important things in anyone's lives. So I think it's something that's worth taking seriously and not just trying to score political points about. And there's been a lot of political point scoring in these last couple of years.
This is a really interesting article, and actually I highly recommend you go to the show notes this week and read this news story for yourself and look at the graphs and the charts they've put together. You can find a link at thepropertyhub.net/Tom2. That's thepropertyhub.net/Tom2. But this isn't the only argument that you've heard made over the last few years. The more laughable one for me is that these campaign groups have said, well, tax has gone up, so rents are going to up because landlords are just going to put them up because they're angry. That is nonsense. Unless you've been under-renting and charging a lot less than the market is at right now, that's just not going to happen, and most people don't do that. The notion that landlords decide what rent levels are and actually, we've all been generous saying this area is £600 a month, but now we're going to charge £800 a month because our tax has gone up, is a nonsense. The market dictates where rent levels lie, not landlords. Landlords have no say. The market has the say. The market dictates where rent levels lie for each and every area. It's not that landlords in London are more greedy than landlords in the north of England, so they charge 3 times as much. No. The market dictates that rents in London should be 3 times as much. So it's nice to see an article that lays out the facts without heavy opinion and just puts to bed some of the nonsense that's been spun in the last few years.
All right, so we are super duper lucky to have Tom Bloxham back on the podcast today. If you haven't heard part 1 of this interview, then there's no need to pause and go back to it right now. You can still listen to this episode in isolation, but do make sure you go back and listen afterwards because there's so much great stuff in there. If you're not familiar with Tom, he is the chairman and founder of Urban Splash, who've won almost 400 awards for design, architecture and regeneration. The work that they've done in regenerating and completely transforming Liverpool and Manchester and other towns as well is absolutely amazing. They've been doing it for 25 years, and Tom's been awarded an MBE for his services to architecture and urban regeneration. So who better to ask about the future than someone who's had such a massive impact on the present?
So if you missed last week's episode, go back and listen because Tom took us through the journey of Urban Splash and how they created a business from nothing that went on to be valued at one point at £100 million. An incredible journey. Rob and I are often talking about the future of property investment and where it's going. This week, though, we wanted to focus on the future. And we really wanted to see what Tom thinks is in store for UK property.
So, Tom, one thing that I've seen you speak about in the past is modular housing, which is something that hasn't really taken off in the UK. Many of our listeners might not even know what it is. So could you talk a bit about modular housing and where you see that fitting into housing in the UK in general?
Yeah, I mean, modular housing's come to us sort of gradually. And what we noticed is all the people who bought our award-winning architect-designed apartments, whenever they moved, none of them, and I mean none of them, actually bought new build houses. They all went to either buy other flats or second-hand houses, Victorian and Georgian terraces typically. And when we looked a bit into this, we saw some statistics, and depending on which statistics you read, something like 60 to 80% of the population, when they consider moving, don't even consider new build housing. They always go for a old Georgian, Victorian, Edwardian terrace. And we started to think why this was. And it depresses me really quite a bit, the monotony of so much of our new build housing. And we thought why this was. And actually, I don't believe it's about style. I believe it's about quality and design. And when I say design, I'm talking about things like big windows, high ceilings, structural walls, so you can make alterations internally without affecting the structure of it. And we then started thinking about how can we build a really modern house and try and become the sort of designer brand of housing and use the reputation we made in the last 25 years doing apartments and refurbs on new build housing. And we were originally going to start with the traditional construction. Then we thought there must be a better way of building than using brick, wet cement brick, relying on Arturian labour, which went out of fashion with every other business in the Middle Ages. And we came up with the idea of making homes in factories. So we were thinking about how we can actually reinvent the modern houses and looked at modular technology. We also looked at other items like telephones. The first telephone I bought, a mobile phone I bought, I don't know, 20 or 30 years ago, cost me $2,500 and was the size of a car battery. It was absolutely useless. And every phone I've bought since then has got cheaper and better and faster. And likewise, my car, I bought a new car, exactly the same one as my last car 10 years later. It was 30% cheaper, better spec, better quality, more reliable, more fuel efficient. And yeah, our houses seem to have been getting more and more expensive and not particularly better. So we are working with modular construction, with building houses in a factory. And earlier this year, we bought the factory from SIG PLC and seeing can we develop some really great designed houses which have got really high ceilings, which are great big windows, which are designed to very small tolerances, work in a factory in factory conditions to improve the quality. What it also allows us to do is allow customers to personalize their house and make everyone bespoke. A bit like today when you buy a new car, you go online and you decide what color you want it, what the spec is, and everyone's unique and individual. So we're trying to do that with housing. So people can actually develop their own houses, pick the color, pick the sort of kitchen, decide whether there's going to be open plan or cellular. Is a kitchen going to be on the ground floor or top floor? And have literally thousands of combinations. So each house is particular and unique to the purchaser.
In order for that to take off in the UK, it sounds like it just should be a no-brainer because it's potentially cheaper and better. But in order for it to take off, do you think the main challenges are going to be technological or economic, or is it a case of attitudes?
I think it's a bit of everything. There's a lot of attitude, and people are still focused on prefab being post-war temporary housing. But actually, I think 10% of the population love something modular, 10% hate it, 80% don't care how it's built. They just want a well-built house. It's actually not cheap at the moment. They're more expensive the way we do it, but it's a much better quality. I think they will become cheaper in time as we get quantum up and as we get the mass up, but at the moment it's still slightly more expensive. And, again, everybody's saying it'll never work because it hasn't worked already, but I believe it will work. I believe we can actually push this technology forward. In most countries overseas, many, many more houses are built in factories than there are in the UK. I believe we will follow suit. I believe it's the way to make housing more affordable and better designed.
Tom, you talked a lot about Liverpool and Manchester and have been a real ambassador for the property markets and property development in those areas. Are you still bullish on those cities and the opportunities that they offer as far as housing is concerned and a place to live?
I mean, I think they're still both great cities. Like many of the northern cities, they're relatively mature as far as residential markets are concerned. People have been living in any number in the last 20 or so years. In most cities in the world, the closer you live to the city centre, the more expensive they are. In both those cities, still they're suburbs which are higher valued than the city centre. I think that will change. The city centre will become the most valuable part. They are still, if you take London, top prices, I don't know, £5,000 or £6,000 a square feet. Even if you believe the top prices in Manchester or Liverpool are sort of £500 a square foot, is less than 10% of London. I believe that discrepancy is too big. I believe those prices will narrow. But it's not just Liverpool and Manchester. I mean, we're also working in Plymouth, in Bristol, in Birmingham, in Sheffield, in Bradford, in many, many cities across the UK. And I think similar stories apply. And, I think at the moment, this country is overly centralised, is overweight to London. And the London property market has been going through its, hiccups over the last year or so. And I think the regions are a good place to invest at the moment.
What city excites you at the moment that maybe other people are overlooking? Which city do you see real potential in?
There's potential in all our cities. And again, it's not for me to say, go here rather than going there. It's actually about finding the city, finding what's special about that city or town, finding out what it's missing, what it needs to reinvent itself. But we just won a big site in Birmingham called Port Loop. For instance, in that place, it's actually a canal running all the way around. It's an island site, would you believe, 7 minutes from Burnley Place. And there we're exploring what's it like to live on an island in the city centre, how can we make a community where pedestrians are more important than cars, how can we make a community where kids can play out on the street again, how can we make a community that's a real sense of community, filled with people, filled with interesting commercial users, filled with people who want to walk into work, who want to cycle, who want to boat, who want to relax in the park. We've just won another site in Milton Keynes, which again is really interesting as a new town, an old new city, working on there. We're bidding in a number of other sites across the country. So, I do believe our modular housing is appropriate in many places all across the UK, and we're keen to expand our offer right across the UK.
Are there any particular indicators that you look at to determine whether a particular city or whether a particular region within that city is ready for your kind of scheme?
It's a number of factors. We like to go where there's political leadership, where there's a vision, where we know what the future of the city is, where someone's leading the city or town and can articulate where it wants to be. We like to go with forward-looking towns and cities where they know where they want to be. I mean, it's great to be near good transport hubs. It's great to have a university. It's great to have a cultural offer inside the city. It's great to, the bigger the city, usually the better. It's also great in a very local area to have something interesting like canals, listed buildings, hills, whatever it might be, to make it interesting.
Tom, we talked a lot about the property market from the viewpoint of people purchasing to live, but the rental market is becoming more and more important in the UK, with the percentage of people now renting increasing every single year. Do you see that trend continuing, and will you as a developer adapt to cater for that market specifically, or do you feel the homes that you have already do adequately cater for that market?
I mean, rental is definitely growing. If you go back to before the First World War, 80% of the housing was in private rent. It's an anathema in the UK, driven by unintended consequence legislation with the Fair Rent Act after the First World War to protect widows and orphans, actually ironically destroyed the whole private rented market. It came back in fairly recently with the advent of ASTs, but it's growing and it's still far smaller in the UK than it is in other countries. So we will find more and more renters, and this is also increasing because people are moving work much more often. And with the increase in stamp duties, buying and selling housing becomes more and more expensive. The other interesting thing we've got in the UK is actually where there is rented property, and there's a massive market. The residential rental market is nearly as big as the commercial property rental market. It's a huge market, but it's dominated by mum and pub landlords. And we're increasingly seeing institutions playing a part, and professional landlords. And we want to play a part of that with Urban Splash, and we are setting up a residential fund, so people can co-invest with us in residential markets. What we're doing slightly differently is most of the people into it are building very big buildings. And by and large, when they build big buildings, they're trying to build them what they describe as being very efficient. What they usually mean by being very efficient is very tall buildings with very long corridors and very small apartments, single aspect apartments off long corridors. They say they're specifically geared around PRS. I don't believe there's anything that's particularly geared around rental or sales. I believe people want bloody good homes, really well-designed homes, and whether they rent them or they buy them. And so what we are trying to do is just make really well-designed homes and make them available for rent or for sale, whether that's modular housing, whether it's listed apartments, whatever sort of scheme it is. And ultimately, and there'll be a few years yet because at the moment our residential fund is only open to professional investors, but ultimately we want to allow the residential fund to be somewhere where retail investors can actually invest in it. So if people want to invest in retail property, rather than having to go out and buy one buy-to-let apartment and pay the stamp duty on that and the tax on that, and if one is void, it's difficult and they can't do it, they can only invest in whole properties. We want to set our fund up which ultimately becomes accessible to retail investors so they can invest as much as they want. The costs of investing are a fraction of what they would be buying real property, and there's much more liquidity in the stock. But that's a few years away, but it's something we're working up to.
In the meantime, before you get that up and running, and for those landlords who now and even in the future will want to own whole properties and continue to be individual landlords, what do you think those people should be doing or thinking about to make sure that they can compete with the institutional players who are increasingly coming into the market?
Well, I think it's, first of all, it's about buying a property well, isn't it? And making really good properties. And so often people are saying, oh, we'll do the nice properties for occupiers, but the ones not quite so nice for investors because they don't matter so much. I fundamentally disagree with that. Again, goes back to my earlier point, only buy stuff that you want to live in or work in yourself. So buy residential property you'd be happy to live in, and then your renters will be. Look after really well. Get a really good managing agent if you're going to use one. Offer longer leases if you want longer leases. Treat your tenants as customers, not as tenants. I mean, still the very language, landlord and tenant, is feudal. And actually, it's much easier to look after your existing customer and let them stay longer than it is to find a new one. But fundamentally, it's buy well, buy the best properties.
Tom, you've had a lot of success in property. And whether we look at this from a property or a business, so when I ask this question, property is a business. So for you, what's been the reasons for your success over the years? Yes, of course, you've made lots of mistakes, which we've covered, and you've overcome them and learned from them. What things would you list as the reasons for your success over the years?
Fundamentally, I think we have a belief in the value of design and a belief in creating great properties to live in or work in. So all our attention is to squeeze every potential out of every scheme we do to make it as good as we can. So that's the first thing to do, to build them well, to look after them, to keep a long-term interest in the properties. Most of them we've ever built, we still own or own some element of it, whereas so much of the property industry is about getting in, getting out quickly. We see it as sort of more as custodians. We try and curate our commercial tenants, so we get a really nice mixture of independent retailers and artists and various other interesting happenings going on in the buildings to make it more interesting. And then we try to market them well with creative marketing, with great images, with a great website, urbansplash.co.uk, social media, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. Find us on those, either Urban Splash or Tom Bloxham MBE. And actually then just try to treat our customers with respect, to look after our customers and to do the best we can.
So Urban Splash has been operating now for 25 years. If we were to come back and talk to you in another 10, 15, 20 years, what do you think you'll have achieved, or what do you hope you'll have achieved in that time?
I'll be a bit older, a bit wiser, no less hair because I haven't got any anyway. What I hope to in the next few years, I hope by then we'll have the modular housing past the proof of concept stages in the moment, and we'll be producing thousands of homes a year. I hope we'll have a show house within an hour's drive of 80% of the population. I hope we'll be selling thousands of new houses that will be specified by people right around the country. I hope we'll have had our residential fund up and running and accessible to the public, listed somewhere, so people can invest in urban splash properties as an investment, long-term investment, paying a yield, as well as owning one themselves. I hope we'll still continue doing those interesting listed buildings around the country, and we'll bring a few more difficult buildings back into play. And I, perhaps hope that one of our new builds will be listed by that time, and perhaps even that we've won the Sterling Prize for one of our schemes, which is an ambition of ours. But perhaps that's hoping for too much. Any one of those things, I'll be very happy.
So often, Rob and I are the teachers. We turn up for the podcast every week and pass on our knowledge. But it's so nice to be the pupil this week, because we've learned so much from Tom in such a short space of time. One of the points that really hit home for me, even after all these years in property, was such a simple one, but often the simple stuff's right in front of you and you miss it. And that was the point about the city centres being the most expensive areas. He's absolutely right. You look at London, the most expensive property is bang in the middle. And you look at many major developed cities around the world, and that is absolutely the case. The most expensive stuff is in the middle, and then it gets cheaper as you go out. But other than London, every other city in the UK, it's the opposite way. Prices in the city centre are not the most expensive, and the most expensive areas are on the outskirts. But that's actually unusual for the world property market, and I could see that shift taking place, particularly in places like Manchester and Birmingham, which are a little further ahead, where the prices are going up, and maybe one day in the future, and it's not hard to believe, that the most expensive part of these cities will be the city centre, especially with the amount of regeneration going into some of these cities. It's a fascinating insight, and one that's really had a complete mental shift for me on where these property markets can go in the future, and it excites me.
Yeah, it's incredible. It's so obvious once he said it, but I hadn't thought of it at all until he did. And with the trend for people wanting more convenience and prioritising amenities over amount of physical space, you can just see that really emphasising that shift. Another point that he made that I thought was fascinating was when he was talking about modular housing, and he was saying how every time you go and buy a new phone or a new car, it's better and cheaper than it was before. And with housing, that's not the case. So surely that's something that's ripe for change. And some of the benefits for modular housing that he laid out were really compelling. So I think it's going to be fascinating over the next decade to see the impact that that has as well, and if it's something that becomes a lot more commonplace. It's absolutely brilliant to get Tom's thoughts on the future. Really got us thinking, and I'm sure it has for you as well. And the only certainty about the future is that Urban Splash are going to be doing more big things. Their plans sound super ambitious and exciting, and based on what they've done before, I absolutely would not bet against them.
So Hub Extra is on the way, but before we get there, we want to acknowledge these wonderful human beings and hubbers who've left us a 5-star review. So first up, thanks to Shodek, who said, "Thank you, Rob and Rob, for your great work. You must be aware you are changing people's lives for the better. I've listened to every single podcast where I always find plenty of knowledge. After a year of listening, I bought my first buy-to-let and I'm doing my first flip also as a joint venture and a commercial to resi project. Keep up the great work." Thank you. Well, thank you and well done on all that progress. And also this week, Paul L78 leaves us a review saying, "First of all, I owe you an apology for not reviewing earlier. Been greedily lapping up the Property Podcast, Ask Rob and Rob, and all the free training courses that the Property Hub offers. I promised myself I'd leave a review once I'd made my first investment, which I recently completed on with the help of the Robs. Their expertise and enthusiasm has kept me focused on my goals while saving the cash to get started. My favourite episode is probably non-property books you should read. These books, via Audible, have replaced my daily intake of cheesy morning DJs into a great opportunity for learning and development. I do not hesitate to recommend the Property Podcast to anyone I know who mentions anything property related. Keep up the fantastic work, guys." Well, thank you for those fantastic reviews. We do not take them for granted. Week after week, these amazing reviews come in. It's just so humbling to hear the action that you are all taking and the impact, however big or small, the podcast's made on those journeys. So congratulations to everyone who's taken action, but an extra special one to those who leave a review and tell us about it.
Well, as if we haven't had enough in this episode already, there's just time to squeeze in Hub Extra, where every week we give you an extra little resource, a tip, a quote, something to think about, and then we back it up with the Hub Extra email, which will hit the inbox of Property Hub members every Friday morning. Now, Rob, before we can reveal the resource we've got this week, unfortunately, to set it up, we need to give a little insight into our TV viewing habits.
Yeah, this is a bit embarrassing, Rob, but I actually feel that this is guilt-free trash TV, because as property investors and enthusiasts, we can watch this because we're learning, right? And this week you're going to prove it.
Yeah, so what we're talking about is a TV show called $1 Million Listing New York, which follows 3 real estate agents in New York City as they go around selling ridiculously expensive apartments. It's reality TV, it's cheesy, but there is a lot to learn as well. One weird effect is it completely biases your perception of price after you've watched a few episodes, and you end up watching it going, oh, 8 million, that seems pretty reasonable. It really is mad, some of the stuff that they sell on there. But one of the people who's featured on there is an agent called Ryan Serhant. He's now got a book out called Sell It Like Serhant, which is pretty good. I'm in the middle of reading it right now. But I can save you some time because the majority of the value that's in the book is captured in a talk that he gave at Google, which you can find on YouTube. So this is a 50-minute long interview where he's talking about his sales secrets and how he's built up the business he has. And it's really, really worth a watch. If you do any selling as part of your job, which most people do in one way or another, then there's some great lessons in there. But he's just such a great storyteller. He's very, very compelling to listen to. And when someone who's achieved so much talks about how they've done it and how they organise their day and how they've worked on their mindset, it's always worth listening. So to make yourself feel a little bit better about watching some cheesy TV, you can then go and learn some lessons off the back of it. So we'll link to that video in the show notes for this episode, which this week are at thepropertyhub.net/Tom2.
So we hope you've enjoyed this double bill of Tom Bloxham. Last week, his journey, this week, the future. And I hope you're excited about the future as we are. Remember, if you want to get in touch and let us know what topics you'd like us to cover in the future or anything else, just want to say hi, get in touch via the socials. You can find the Property Hub on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. And the handle for all of those is Property Hub UK. Or you can join in the conversation at thepropertyhub.net. Jump on the forum there and discuss these episodes. And if you want to know what Rob and I do behind the scenes and the businesses we're involved, then you can get along to thepropertyhub.net/discover. And we hold a monthly webinar where we talk about the businesses and services that we operate in the background. We'll be back with Ask Rob and Rob on Tuesday. And of course, the Property Podcast on Thursday. But until then, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.